have a kid with you because I think you're going to be an amazing dad. At the fun parts and at the hard parts.
Yeah, well, can you picture me saying, go to your room, you're grounded?
Can you hear me say you're grounded?
You said that to me last week.
Is being a mom the toughest job on the planet? More difficult than hard labor, ditch digging, mining, and garbage collection combined? Well, if you were to read Mom Life Comics, a series of simplistic images with overlaid text that became popular on Instagram within the momosphere, a community comprised of minion meme-sharing Farmville addicts whose hearts pump more box wine and Xannies than blood, created by Mary Catherine Starr, then the answer is an obvious yes. Mom Life Comics reached mainstream popularity for perhaps all the wrong reasons in mid-2022, after this particular comic went viral, wherein Mary laments the differences between her and her husband, highlighting her selflessness compared to his selfishness, and deciding who should have the right to eat the final peach. Meanwhile, The Rock.
Well, look, the last ripe peach. Not a chicken. I want a fried chicken with pink sauce.
Each comic is a variation upon this same theme. Mary is a beleaguered mother who does everything to enrich the lives of her children, while her husband is a loser do-nothing who refuses to do anything to help with the parenting. Except people quickly discovered, upon only slight investigation, that Mary's husband is in fact a lawyer who works a second job to support her and their kids, that he cooks most if not all of their meals, and tends to the subsequent dishes, does the grocery shopping, the laundry, the yard work, and watches the children while she does attend to the strenuous job of teaching yoga 3 nights a week. And the entirety of her comic series appears to be self-centered whining from an extremely privileged woman, bemoaning that she is forced to take care of her own children. However, clearly this message spoke to a lot of other moms on Instagram who found Mary's message relatable. Although that may be because mommy bloggers on Instagram are suffering from what the medical community has described as a clinical lack of human decency, self-awareness, and the immortal soul. That message is that being a mom really is the toughest job on earth. So the question is, well, is it? Is being a full-time mother really more difficult than working full-time or balancing motherhood and having a career? And before you dismiss this topic outright by humming a few bars of the Chemical Workers song, I should emphasize that there are a lot of people, like Mary, who truly believe that motherhood is tougher than shoveling cyanide or mining asbestos.
The world's toughest job.
It's basically 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There are no breaks, no vacations. If you had a life, we'd ask you to sort of give that life up. Also, the position is going to pay absolutely nothing.
Excuse me?
That's crazy.
What if I told you there's someone that currently holds this position right now?
Who?
Moms.
Make a bridge and get over it.
For example, there's this woman who made a reward chart for her husband that similarly went viral a few years ago. Although, to be fair, she did later claim that this was a joke, only after catching a lot of flack online. And the new She-Hulk television series posits as its main focus that women do far more than men while being far better at it.
So I'm an expert at controlling my anger because I do it infinitely more than you.
Shut the f*** up!
Thus today, let's examine women's life satisfaction and happiness in general in the decades since the women's rights movement, as well as the relationship between motherhood and women's well-being, to understand if being a mom really is as difficult as some women, like Mary, the real peach that she is, claim it to be. But first, and because while Mom Life Comics may be more concerned with securing the safety of the last peach, the rest of us have other safety and security concerns. Namely our online privacy and financial safety, which is where this video's sponsor comes in, Aura. Aura is an all-in-one security suite that provides you with everything you need to stay safe online. Aura includes financial fraud and credit protection that monitors your credit score and transactions, alerting you when there's been unusual activity, and allowing you to instantly lock unwarranted inquiries into your credit history, as well as assist with lost wallet remediation, and each plan comes with an insurance policy that covers up to $1 million in identity theft insurance. Along with your credit score, Aura also detects identity theft, notifying you when any accounts or passwords have been breached, and includes a password manager to help you secure your data. Aura also comes with malware protection, built-in antivirus software, and a VPN. So with just Aura, you can not only protect yourself, but change your location to access TV shows and films not available in your region. And if that wasn't impressive enough, Aura also offers a family plan that provides protection for up to 5 family members, including alerting you if your children's identities have been compromised. Finally, Aura provides 24/7 customer support because your online security doesn't have time to wait for business hours. All of these services, all in one convenient place, start at just $12 a month annually or $15 monthly for an individual plan. If you click my link down in the description and in the pinned comment, you'll also get 6 months of service absolutely free, so you can check out Aura for yourself and figure out if you like the service. And I think you will. Thanks so much to Aura for sponsoring this video. And now that we've got a service that can help keep us and our families happy and safe online, let's talk about the paradox of women's happiness. The women's rights movement instilled in generations of young women a belief that they could do it all and have it all. She could have a career, a family, and passionate hobbies, and balance all of these things in perfect harmony. But has that really been the case? Or has she chosen to instead have none of them, preferring the comfort of a cat and a box of wine?
This smells like a goon bag. Oh, that smells like a goon bag.
For over 30 years, in the US, the number of women staying at home as full-time mothers has been declining, as while 49% of single and married moms stayed home rather than working in 1967, that percentage fell to just 23% in 1999. But those trends started to change in the late 2000s, as by 2012, 29% of mothers chose to stay home with children rather than work, according to Pew data. A more recent poll from Motherly reports that this trend has continued into 2021, at which time 32% of mothers were mothering full-time. Despite the increase in stay-at-home motherhood rising to just under a third of moms, 60% reported to Pew that they believed children were better off with a full-time parent in the home. At the same time, while only 29% of people polled in 1987 completely disagreed with the notion that women should return to traditional roles as mothers and homemakers, by 2010, that rose to 58% of the population who were completely opposed to said traditional roles, and polling seems to be indicative that women aren't exactly happy about it. A 2018 Motherly survey found that 74% of mothers felt that they were unsupported by society, and in just 1 year, that percentage increased to 85%. By 2020, it was 89%, and a full 97% of millennial mothers in that year reported feeling burned out at least some of the time. In 2022, 42% of stay-at-home moms reported being dissatisfied or very dissatisfied with their childcare situation. As such, even though more and more women were staying at home with children, they didn't seem all too pleased about it, as Gallup polling is illustrative that while 51% of women reported preferring to stay at home in 1992, only 44% reported preferring to be a homemaker by 2016. Things appear to be changing for millennial and Gen Z women, however, as in 2015, of mothers under the age of 18, 56% reported preferring to be a homemaker over working outside of the home. Those under the age of 18 who did not have a child were less positive towards homemaking, with only 39% reporting to prefer that lifestyle over employment. So even though moms were unhappy, more and more started staying at home. Is this because being a mother is more stressful than working and parenting part-time or working full-time? That seems illogical, but it's possible. Or is it instead that women are just less satisfied with their lives in general, completely outside of motherhood? Has the women's rights movement really liberated us, or has it made us miserable? For years, social scientists and journalists alike have noted the seeming paradox of life satisfaction in women, in that the freer women have become, following the sexual revolution, the less happy we appear to be. But how is that possible that women become less satisfied as our options in life have expanded massively? Women can do anything. We can be a girl boss in a leadership position at a major company. We can be scientists and doctors. We can vote and be elected to top political positions, including the Vice President of the United States, even though we haven't made it to the highest station in the nation, and one woman certainly never will, no matter how much she complains about it.
Why aren't I 50 points ahead?
And yet all of this has seemingly come along with decreases in women's happiness. This paradox was assessed by Stevenson and Wolfers 2009, utilizing data from the U.S. General Social Survey, or GSS, collected between 1972 and 2006, which questioned women on their subjective levels of well-being, measured by the question, how would you say things are these days? Would you say that you are very happy, pretty happy, or not too happy? Including additional questions to assess satisfaction with their marriage, health, financial situation, and their job. Across baselines of satisfaction, these data were indicative that women unilaterally have become less happy over time. Specifically, in the 1970s, women were more likely than men to report being very happy, but by the 1980s, this difference had almost completely disappeared. In contrast, in the 1970s, men and women were about as likely to report being not too happy, but by the 1990s, women were more likely to report being not too happy than were men. regression analysis further revealed that while women's happiness has dropped, there has been very little change in men's reported happiness, indicating that women's happiness has fallen both absolutely and relative to that of men. Men instead seem pretty stable in their happiness, just wanting to grill and perhaps even eat a peach.
I once secretly ate every urn of my father's beloved honey peaches, and the next day he brought before me a servant girl that he had accused of a crime. And he placed her hand on the table, and he drew his knife, and he delivered the punishment.
To convert these findings into proportional changes, women were 1 percentage point less likely than men to say that they were not too happy in 1972, but by 2006, they were 1 percentage point more likely to report being not too happy. In terms of distributions, in 1972, the average woman was as happy as a man in the 53.3rd percentile of happiness, while in 2006, the average woman's happiness aligned with men's at the 48.8th percentile, meaning the average happiness of a given woman was on average 5 points lower in 2006 than 30 years earlier. In contrast, men saw slight increases in happiness, such that the average man in 2006 reported happiness levels that aligned with men in the 50.7 percentile in 1972. That's not a big change, but just to be clear, these happiness levels from the 1970s represent a population that survived thalidomide, the Korean War, Vietnam, and bell-bottom jeans, and they were still happier than Americans in 2006. Overall then, between the 1970s and 2000s, women and men's relationship to happiness reversed, with women largely being happier in the 70s and men largely being happier in the 2000s. Almost like there wasn't a meat grinder in the form of the draft for men, but there were a lot of changes in the US and in gender roles during that time frame. So Stevenson and Wolfers also conducted additional analyses to understand the potential influence of external variables on this trend. However, even when adding in employment, the presence of children, education, and marriage, the inclusion of these controls had little effect on the gender happiness gap. That is, women were less happy in 2006 than they were in 1972, and that outcome was not explained by whether or not those women had children, were employed, had attained a higher degree of education, or were married. I mean, there was a major social change that happened over that period of time, but at least according to these data, that change could not be attributed to other common correlates of happiness. When comparing the decline in women's happiness with the decline in happiness experienced by decreased GDP, the authors found that women's happiness drop was equivalent to a GDP reduction of 0.32 points, such that this lowered happiness in women was similar in scope to a significant drop in economic well-being across all populations in its effect on lowered happiness. That is, women were less happy in general, as if they had significantly less wealth, regardless of actual wealth. This was not the case equally for all women, as happiness for both male and female African Americans increased over this period of assessment, but the increase was greater for Black women than for Black men. When looking to data from Europe, with which to compare to the US from Eurobarometer, these scholars found that both men and women were the most satisfied with their lives in the 2000s than in the early 70s, but that the increases in happiness were greater for men than for women, illustrating a significant decrease in the happiness gap that existed between men and women in previous decades, mirroring trends in the States. To try and get a clear idea of why it is that women's happiness was declining or at least stagnating worldwide, the authors also examined several domains that may influence life satisfaction in more detail. They found no significant difference in satisfaction with employment across the sexes, although women who reported their job as keeping house generally reported lower levels of job satisfaction than did women employed in the workforce. However, over time, the gap between job satisfaction expressed by women working outside the home and inside the home decreased. And although this change in no way explained differences in overall happiness, the findings are indicative that women are happier being homemakers now than they were in the 1970s, following the women's liberation movement, a trend we will see a lot of over the course of this video, and perhaps reminiscent of a classic Joni Mitchell song. Financial satisfaction followed a similar trend, as fewer women reported being satisfied with their household finances in the 1970s than they did in the 2000s. And while there was a decline in men's financial satisfaction as well, it was significantly smaller than that seen in women. However, when marriage was added into the equation, the relationship was not so clear-cut. Both married men and women became more financially satisfied over time, while unmarried persons of both sexes became less satisfied, although again, this decrease was most prominent in women. Regarding marriage, women always reported being less happy with their marriage than did men, but women's reported marriage satisfaction declined over the years. During this period, pun intended, women's assessment of their physical health improved, which makes sense given the increased focus on women's health, including gynecological health, over time. In contrast, men's reported subjective health remained stable. When all variables that increased women's happiness were included as controls, researchers found that residual unexplained variables outside of those assessed were causing more damage to women's overall happiness than the control variables contributed to positively. With the falling reported well-being of women, these scholars also queried 12th graders to understand how young people in the 2000s may have differed from adults of previous decades, and found that 12th grade girls reported themselves to be under more pressure and having less leisure time with friends than previous generations, and that this decrease in adolescent satisfaction over time occurred both absolutely and in relationship to 12th graders of the past, and relative to boys as well. When asked what aspects of their life they believed was important, teenage girls in 2006 expressed increased importance of 13 of the 14 domains assessed, with the exception of one, finding purpose and meaning in life, being the only domain that young girls were not more concerned with in that year than they had been in decades past. Specifically, girls attached more importance to non-domestic related aspirations, such as being successful in work, finding a steady job, contributing to society, and being a leader in the community. You would think these things would be related to increased focus on finding meaning in one's life, but they were not, which at least to me may indicate that the desire to work and for success is perhaps more performative than it is aspirational. That is, over time though, women became more like Patrick Bateman.
There is an idea of a Patrick Bateman, some kind of abstraction, but there is no real me.
Men also expressed increased interest in these domains, but to a lesser extent. As such, young girls have come to be more and more preoccupied with work and activism, while being less preoccupied with actually finding meaning in their lives. And this change in interest has coincided with a continual decrease in female happiness, both universally and in comparison to their male counterparts, that is not well explained by increasing physical health, decreasing marital satisfaction, decreased financial satisfaction, and increased satisfaction with being a homemaker over an employee or vice versa. The aforementioned assessment from Stephen and Wolfers caused something of a stir at its time of publication, both in academia and the media, despite coming from mass-level survey data. It flew in the face of all of the promises of feminism, in that it didn't seem that women's liberation had actually made women happier. Quite the opposite, in fact. It was speculated by some that the reason for this paradox was the increased pressures on women to be girl bosses in the workforce, but also still come home and be good moms and wives, and had created an unrealistic expectation that women could have it all, and subsequently left women feeling unhappy when they were unable to live up to that unrealistic expectation. So what about women who do try to have it all and attain some degree of success at accomplishing that goal? Are they happier than women who don't? Actually, according to Motherly's 22 survey on the state of motherhood, 22% of non-employed mothers said a cultural shift around the expectation that women do it all would be the best way that they believed they could decrease their feelings of burnout. But for more answers, we can look to a study from Bertrand 2013 who utilized data from the GSS between 1972 and 2010 and the American Time Use Survey's Wellbeing Instrument from 2010 to examine the relationship between education, career, and satisfaction in women. For women born between 1944 and 1957, those with neither a career nor family were about as likely to report being very happy as those with a career and no family, 28.4% and 29.9% respectively. In other words, having a career for this generation did absolutely nothing for their well-being. Women from this cohort with a family and no career were the happiest, with 45.9% reporting being very happy, while a slightly smaller percentage, 42.2% of women with both a family and a career reported being somewhat happy. For college-educated women born after 1957, things were a bit different, as while women with neither a career nor a family were the least likely to report being very happy, at a somewhat lower level than those from the older cohort, 26.6%, women with a career but no family were more likely to report being very happy at 36.8%. Those with both a career and family were only slightly more prone to report being very happy at 39.6%, but once again, women with family but no career were the most likely to report being very happy at 47.2%. As such, women under the age of 55 when this study was published were slightly more likely to be very happy when they had a family and no career than women over that age, while the percentage of very happy women with both a career and a family decreased slightly by 2.6%. In contrast, women with a career but no family saw the largest changes in percentages of happiness, increasing by 6.9% in those born after 1957. Again, a trend that aligns with societal changes, as these women would have come of age during the height of the women's liberation movement, but also the launch of Sputnik. Coincidence? I think not.
There is no such thing as a coincidence. The fact that you're watching this video means you are energetically aligned with me and this message. Your thoughts create your reality. But you already knew that, yet you still live a life that you dread.
When looking just to college-educated women over the age of 40 who had largely ended their fertile years, career satisfaction was no longer a significant predictor of life satisfaction. Marriage predicted happiness in all women of all ages, but for women over 40, being both married and having a career was no longer related to happiness. Similarly, having kids and a husband were always associated with happiness, but having both a family and a career was unrelated to happiness in women over the age of 40. Compared to women that had neither a career nor a family, those with only family were happier, less sad and less stressed, while those with only a career reported lower sense of meaning in their daily lives. Further, it appeared that the combination of career and family decreased positive affect and increased sadness, stress, and tiredness. There was no evidence for greater satisfaction in women who managed to combine having a family with a career, nor that women with a career but no family were more satisfied than women that had neither. In total, stay-at-home wives were less stressed, tired, and sad, and spent about 4% less of their day in a poor mood state than women with a career, who spent about 2 to 3% more of their average day in such a state. Additionally, the worst off group, according to this analysis, appeared to be wives and mothers that were working some sort of job but who did not have a career. Thus, it does seem, at least according to these data, that women who try to have it all were less likely to find happiness in doing so than women who focused exclusively on raising a family.
You kids don't know what you want. That's why you're still kids, 'cause you're stupid.
The persistent, albeit shortening gap between male and female happiness may actually also help explain another major cause of life distress, but also forming another seeming paradox, in that the wider the gap between happiness levels in heterosexual couples, the greater the likelihood that said couple would get divorced, as seen in a study from Guven, Senek, and Sichnoff, whose name definitely sounds a lot like a person of shadow. Although the divorce rate in the US has declined since the 1990s, falling from almost 5 per 1,000 people in crude analysis to 3 per 1,000 in 2018, more than half of marriages in the country still end in divorce. And part of that decline in divorce rates is likely not because couples are separating less, but rather because they're far less likely to get married in the first place, as the marriage rate in the States has plummeted, dropping from nearly 10 per thousand in 1990 to 7 per thousand in 2016, and then decreasing another 3 points by 2020. As such, Guven et al. Were interested in how the happiness gap between the sexes might have influenced divorce rates, which they assessed using data from the German Socioeconomic Panel between 1984 and 2007, the British Household Panel Survey between 1996 and 2007, and the Household Income and Labor Dynamics Survey in Australia between 2001 and, you guessed it, 2007. So, 2 former imperialist powers and an actual threat.
So I can wish for anything.
Anything!
They found that after controlling for the total level of happiness of a couple, as well as various other potential confounds including age differences, education of spouses, duration of the marriage, number of children, and household income, a 1-unit increase in the happiness gap between spouses raised the probability of separation by 0.23 in Germany, 0.2 in Australia, and 0.08 in the United Kingdom. The average general risk of breakup at any point is about 2%, and as such, the happiness gap represented a non-negligible risk of marriage dissolution. This effect was not equal across the sexes, as, in all 3 countries, a situation in which the woman was unhappier than her partner increased the risk of separation in the following year by about 0.5, while such an effect was not present in couples wherein the male was less happy than his female partner. Such findings provide an explanation as to why, in Australia, 60% of separated women reported that she was responsible for the divorce, compared to only 16% who attributed sole responsibility to her ex-husband. Similarly, nearly 2/3 of German women reported initiating divorce. As such, women are generally more likely to end a marriage, and couples for whom female happiness is lower than male happiness are more at risk of breaking up in the following year. That is, your girl is more likely to leave you if you're happier than she is. So I guess, get more depressed, lads. At least on the positive side, she'll probably help you on that journey. And perhaps that's the only time she'll help with anything. Of course, not according to Mom Life Comics, but let's just say I don't think she's a very trustworthy source. And before you rush to the comments to complain that I'm only making these jokes because I'm a pick-me, I regret to inform you that it's instead because most of them were, as with most female comedians, written by a man. Although I did write that one, but only because he told me to.
What about all the funny female comedians? Like, No.
Male income, female unemployment, sharing the same nationality or region, having divorced parents, the number of previous marriages, and the presence of children in the household were all non-significant in influencing the direct effect of the happiness gap's presence in general on divorce rates, While higher female income and more hours worked did magnify the effect of the happiness gap on separation. To reiterate then, children don't influence women's likelihood of instigating a divorce, but how much money she makes and how happy her husband is comparative to her do influence divorce rates. Specifically, following the initial marriage, a baseline happiness gap of 1 unit increased the probability of breakup in the following years by about 4% in the UK and Germany, and 2.3% in Australia, which represents between 7 and 15% the average risk of separation per annum. Thus, while a happiness gap always provides a threat to the security of a marriage, the gap is most harmful within the last few years after tying the knot. And again, not for men, only really for women. As such then, while yes, women tend to be happier than their husbands even now, as women's happiness has massively decreased to become closer and closer to that of her husband, the likelihood that she will divorce him has increased, perhaps in part explaining consistently high divorce rates, which although peaking in the 1980s are still higher than in previous generations in the US. Part of the paradox of women's happiness then is that if she is less happy than her husband, rather than more so, she's more likely to divorce him, and women are more likely now to be unhappy than in the past. Thus, divorce rates partially explained. If women are less happy now than they were in the past, and this trend started to occur around the world around the same period of time, all following the women's rights movement, we need to perhaps look more closely at the women's rights movement and gender equality to understand how feminism has influenced women's happiness. So, while women are happier than men, although less happy than they used to be before the rise of the girl boss and the women's rights movement, it seems that the imbalance in happiness between the sexes is part of what keeps marriages together, as perhaps such a gap is seen as normative, and without said gap, women feel that something with their marriage is just off, all of which seems quite paradoxical. But what else might help explain why women's happiness is decreasing? Well, data from Laleev and Stutzer 2009 are indicative that part of the problem may be, only adding to the paradox, liberalism.
Valentine's Day is a sham created by card companies to reinforce and exploit gender stereotypes.
Evelyn, this is the lady I was telling you about.
At least in Switzerland. In 1981, Swiss citizens voted on an amendment to their constitution which would specify that women and men specifically should have equal rights, which previously included language about the equality of all human beings with no mention of sex. They just really wanted to specify that all human beings included women.
Wrong.
The amendment passed with just over 60% of the vote, and the main reasons given by those who voted in the affirmative, 70% concerned equal pay and women's value being equivalent to that of men, while the other 30% mentioned women's rights in the family and in education. These scholars compared data collected during the 1981 referendum with information on labor market and subjective well-being outcomes measured by the Swiss Labor Force Survey between 1991 and 2003 to understand the long-term effects of voting for liberal policies on happiness in women, taking into consideration changes to the wage gap that surely that constitutional amendment must have done something to ameliorate. Although women's wages remained lower than men's on average after the amendment that made gender discrimination illegal, even though it was already illegal, but also meaning that the gap could no longer be attributed to inequality and unfair pay, there was a marked increase in wage rates of women in line with equal rights being approved of by much of the populace, while there were little changes in men's wages. In 1981, in communities where less than 60% of residents supported the amendment, women made on average 30% less than men, while in communities where more than 60% supported the change, the wage gap remained, with women earning 24% less. Initially, women in regions with more than 60% approval tended to have attained a higher level of education and had spent on average 2 or more years in the workplace more than women in more conservative regions, comparative to men. By 2003, the average wage gap in Switzerland between men and women shrunk to 13.8%. Specifically, for each 1 standard deviation increase in regional support for the amendment in 1981, the wage gap was reduced by 2.4% in the 90s and early 2000s. Further, a 1-point increase in the share of people in an area that supported the change was related to a 4.9 reduction in the gap in those areas. While regional approval had no apparent influence on changes in women's schooling outcomes, areas with higher approval saw an increase of 1/6 the average difference in work experience between men and women disappear over time. That is, women were working slightly more than in years prior. So the initiative appeared to have worked to a pretty significant degree, even if the wage gap did not disappear altogether. which of course is a pipe dream for a wide variety of reasons, including but not limited to the realities that women tend to choose different occupations, choose to be in the workforce for shorter periods of time due to child rearing or choosing to leave the workforce altogether to be full-time mothers, and that women are simply less likely to ask for a raise than are men. Point is, in the liberal areas of Switzerland in particular, women were seeing a lot more gender parity in the workforce by 2003 than they were in 1981, although there were some significant differences in workforce participation based on more broad political characteristics of the region. So, were women in the more liberal parts of Switzerland that not only supported the amendment but subsequently did see greater reductions in the wage gap happier after gaining so much ground? Surely women with more independence in an area that is more supportive of women's equal rights must have been happier than women being oppressed in rural, backwards, conservative Switzerland, right?
Wrong.
Well, not really. Using data from the Swiss Household Panel survey from 1999 to 2001, which questioned Swiss citizens on their levels of satisfaction in life and in the workplace, as well as their perceptions that women were discriminated against, Aliv and Stutzer were able to see just how happy Swiss women were by region. Men and women in liberal areas had similar levels of life satisfaction, but the levels of life satisfaction reported by women in these areas was higher than that of men in conservative communities. Additionally, employed women were more satisfied than employed men, reporting a 0.16 higher score of subjective well-being than their male counterparts. Remember, not only is it normal across the world, or at least it was, for women to be happier than men, in fact, seemingly imperative for women to be happier than men for marriages to last, thus none of this is really surprising. What may be more surprising, though, is that when female gender was assessed by approval of equal rights in a region, employed women were significantly less satisfied with their lives in liberal areas. Specifically, communities with a 1-point standard deviation greater amendment approval rate reported an average reduction in life satisfaction by 0.2 points on a 10-point scale. To put that into context, a 0.2-point reduction in life satisfaction is equivalent to the negative effect of not having completed compulsory education on satisfaction, and 1/7 the negative effect of unemployment on satisfaction. That is, the deleterious effect of a smaller wage gap in liberal areas on women's individual happiness was about the same as if that woman had not completed high school. Not only is that a woman moment, it's a certified bruh moment.
You don't have another guy to wrestle with for 10 years.
Cool.
Bruh, you know,
One may think perhaps that this is just because women hated their jobs, but that wasn't the case, as women reported higher job satisfaction than did men. Instead, it seems that part of the problem may have been that while women liked their jobs more than men, those in liberal communities felt like they were being more discriminated against than women in the more conservative communities. Just to reiterate then, the women in the liberal regions that were more in favor of securing equal rights for women, where there was a smaller wage gap, were not only less happy with their lives outside of their job satisfaction, but they were more likely than women in traditionalist regions to feel as though they were being mistreated and discriminated against based on their sex. The feminists got what they wanted in Switzerland, and yet what they wanted left them less satisfied and feeling more victimized. So, girl power, I guess? Then again, Switzerland is a country that recently legalized euthanasia pods, so at least their unhappy but liberated women have a way out.
Dead or alive, you are
going in the pod.
Even if women are less happy now than they were in the past before the rise of girl power and girl bosses, we would certainly expect that even if women are less happy now than they were in decades past, that at least they're happier in the West where they have greater equality than other parts of the world where women lack equal rights. Right?
wrong.
Well, data from Zweig 2015 actually seemed to be indicative that women are perhaps happier in less developed countries than they are in developed ones where they have equal rights. Zweig utilized data from 73 countries collected from the Gallup World Poll survey in 2009. This dataset contained 20 developed countries, 12 transitional countries in Eastern and Central Europe, 16 Asian, 17 Latin American, and 8 African countries. They found that there were 10 countries where women were more satisfied than men, 2 where men were more satisfied than women, and 61 with no significant difference between the sexes. The 2 countries where men were more satisfied than women were Costa Rica and Italy, which is surprising given the nature of Italian mothers.
I came home and was like, Mom, next year I'm gonna be stronger, faster, and I'm gonna make the team. She's like, no, son. You're raising black kids. Genetics, boy, you make pizzas, that's what you do.
Only 2 of the 10 countries where women were happier than men were developed first world nations. The gender happiness gap was found to not reflect individual nations' levels of development via GDP, and in fact, they found a slightly negative slope, indicating that women may be happier in less developed countries than in more developed ones. Perhaps also surprisingly to many in the Western world, women were happiest relative to men in Islamic and Buddhist countries comparatively to historically Christian ones. Using the number of women serving in national parliament as a stand-in for women's rights in a country, there was no relationship between the number of women serving in the government and the female-male happiness gap. When controlling for additional variables, including demographic characteristics, life circumstances, and economic factors, the total number of countries wherein women were happier than men increased to 16. More specifically, women in the same occupations with the same income, demographic characteristics, and life circumstances as men were significantly happier than men in 24% of the countries assessed. As such, and as surprising as it may seem, women are happier than men across the globe, and the likelihood that a woman will be happier than a man in a given country is seemingly negatively associated with that country being a first world developed nation. Thus, women are more likely to be happy than men in Iran, which the World Economic Forum has ranked 150 out of 156 countries on gender parity in 2021, than they are in Sweden, which US News and World Report surveying ranked as the best country in the world for women in 2022, and which the WEF placed slightly lower at 5th place for women. Then again, there's not much of a difference between Sweden and Iran anymore, at least by some estimates, as even if the weather's not so sunny, it's all still Shiite.
Boo! You stink!
Looking to a more recent assessment from Bell and Blanchflower 2021, we can see that despite the decreases in women's happiness relative to men's, the gap remains in the Anglosphere, as their analysis showed that men had significantly lower life satisfaction levels than women in England, Scotland, Wales, and North Ireland over the period of time between 2016 and 2019, with controls added into the equation. Additionally, men scored significantly below women in unhappiness in Scotland using the Scottish Health Survey between 2008 and 2018, and in England using the Health Survey of England between 2003 and 2016, evidencing the persistence of the paradox. Thus, even though recently, despite all the supposed strides in women's rights and equality, women largely remain less happy than men. But the last 2 years in particular have been plagued, pun intended, with a very specific issue that has contributed negatively to just about everyone's happiness across the world, and that's been COVID and its associated lockdowns. Motherly surveys are indicative that young mothers struggled under the pandemic, but also that more and more of them became full-time parents. For Gen X mothers, 37% reported leaving or quitting their jobs during COVID, and nearly half, 46% of Millennial and Gen Z moms say that they left the workforce last year specifically because of childcare issues. The pandemic also seemingly influenced women's willingness to have more children, as this survey also found that women were 9% less likely to say that she wanted another child in 2022 compared to 2021, and 13% less likely compared to 2020. With these surveys in mind, we should look to a massive study from Blanchflower and Bryce in 2022, who examined the paradox of women's well-being across various countries, taking the COVID pandemic into consideration in their analysis. In this vast assessment, they found that the percentage of women who reported being very happy steadily declined between 1972 and 2006. And although the number of men who reported being very happy also declined, the slope was far steeper for women. COVID, however, represented a unique negative influence on the well-being of both sexes, as happiness fell in 2021 to levels never previously seen in the last 50 years of data collection, and to a degree that was not comparable to the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009, which also struck a blow to American happiness. Interestingly, the recession barely impacted well-being when compared to COVID lockdowns, school closures, and social distancing. Further, female happiness fell more during the pandemic than did male happiness. Outside of the US, Blanchflower and Brighton examined life satisfaction in 37 European countries, utilizing data from the Eurobarometer surveys between 2003 and 2021. They found general declines in happiness between 2019 and 2021, and just like in the US, the Great Recession produced comparatively little decline in most nations, with the exception of Greece, Portugal, Italy, and Spain, which did see significantly lower life satisfaction in 2008 and 9. In contrast, some nations actually saw increased life satisfaction during the recession, namely Denmark, Finland, Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, and the UK.
Truly a laundry list of the worst people on the planet, and I use the term people extremely loosely. All that's missing are the South Africans to really round out the arseholes of the Earth compilation album.
Eddie,
yes,
if
sir.
You by your own assessment are a racist, right?
Yes.
Then what are you doing here breaking bread with black people?
Because he's a racist as well. The black man is worse racist than I am.
Really?
You better believe it. What do you think happened in Rwanda and Burundi, Louis?
And it's not bloody surprising me, 'cause we're a bunch of ignorant loudmouths with no sense of humor.
Well, that was a weird aside. Anyway, during COVID, however, things were far more negative. Maybe not more negative than that, but you get what I mean. 8 of the 37 countries assessed, including Austria and the UK, experienced falls of over 20 base points in life satisfaction. The drop was even larger in Denmark, which consistently ranks among the happiest nations on Earth. There were some exceptions, however, as happiness increased for both men and women during COVID in Albania, Bulgaria, Greece, Macedonia, Portugal, Romania, and Serbia. In 19 of the 37 countries, men's life satisfaction remained significantly higher than women's, including in several of the Scandinavian countries, specifically Iceland, Norway, and Sweden, which all report generally very high levels of population happiness and pride themselves on gender equality. Beyond the CUF in general, the scholars noted a shift in life satisfaction over time, as men had lower life satisfaction before the turn of the 21st century, at which point it tended to even out with women, if not supersede, female levels of happiness in several instances. 2006, 2012, and 2014 data from the European Social Survey, which measured 5 negative variables associated with life satisfaction by asking subjects how often in the past week they felt depressed, anxious, sad, lonely, or that their sleep was restless, found that in every case, men had fewer affective disturbances than women. In contrast, feeling cheerful and being in good spirits, feeling calm and relaxed, being active and vigorous, waking up feeling fresh and rested, and reporting that daily life was filled with things that were interesting were all positively associated with being a man.
Nobody cares about when you do that and there's like muscles there.
It's that men can cry. So it's okay to be weak.
Could you imagine being a man? It must be so...
Eurobarometer data collected during the pandemic between March and April of 2021 found that life satisfaction and feeling calm were both related positively to being a male, while fear, loneliness, helplessness, frustration, and uncertainty were all negatively related to being a man. Thus, in Europe, much as in the States, women were at one point a lot happier than men, but for the last 20 years, the happiness roles of the sexes have seemingly reversed, and women were more deleteriously affected by COVID lockdowns than were men. In the UK specifically, comparative to the United States, life satisfaction increased incrementally for both men and women, and female life satisfaction was above that of men for the majority of years before the coup. COVID caused the life satisfaction rates of both sexes to plummet. However, female life satisfaction in 2021 fell below its former historic lows, while for men the fall left them with levels of satisfaction similar to those reported in 1995 and in the mid-1970s. The mid-70s makes sense as that was during Nam, but was Waterworld really that bad to cause a massive decrease in life satisfaction in men?
I liked Waterworld. Fucking postman apologist.
As such, in the UK, women were less happy under COVID than they had been in nearly 50 years that life satisfaction was being measured. The world ends, women most affected. Specifically, women had always reported higher levels of life satisfaction than men in the UK on these instruments up until 2019, at which point female life satisfaction fell below that of men, and women's well-being declined more than that of men between 2020 and 2021. In 11 of the 79 survey instruments used, men's happiness was below that of women's. In 21, they were the same, and in 47 cases, male rates were above female rates. The extreme decline in female happiness during COVID specifically was seemingly somewhat temporary, however, for as of late 2021, women's happiness again overtook that of men, and their levels of life satisfaction became equal to that of their male counterparts, despite the fact that female anxiety was always higher than that of men. Despite this leveling out, though, under COVID, men's well-being still improved more proportionally compared with the well-being of women, which took a far larger hit initially in late 2020 and early 2021. We can zoom out further than just Europe and the US and the UK to understand the gender happiness gap, as Blanchflower and Bryson also examined data from the World Gallup polls between 2005 and 2021, which includes 166 countries worldwide. In general, results were indicative that men were seemingly happier in the moment than women, but less happy if asked a question inviting them to reflect upon their general levels of happiness. 30 countries reported negative male coefficients, meaning men were less happy than women, including the Nordic countries, specifically Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden. Again, countries celebrated for their levels of gender equality. 59 countries had no significant coefficients, and just under half of all nations assessed, 77, had positive male coefficients, again indicating that men were becoming happier. These nations wherein men's happiness was increasing included the US, Canada, Germany, Greece, Spain, New Zealand, and Austria, as well as developing countries such as Afghanistan, Iraq, Morocco, Mozambique, and Rwanda, as well as former Soviet bloc countries such as Georgia, Belarus, and Ukraine. Although again, this was 2021, not 2022.
How quickly the tide turns.
In total then, it seems that across the world, women were far more negatively impacted by the COVID pandemic, particularly early on, than were men. Although their happiness did tend to bounce back to a certain degree over time, the trend seems to be consistent that going into a post-pandemic world, the paradox of women's happiness is not going anywhere. The thing that started in the 70s is only becoming more pronounced. Despite all the supposed strides in gender parity, women are less happy now than seemingly ever.
Good. Fuck 'em! Who cares?
So if women's happiness has decreased over time as more and more women have entered the workforce, how do children influence women's happiness? Do children make women happy, even if equal rights hasn't? That might sound like a dumb question to some, but there's clearly a lot of mothers who feel overwhelmed and unhappy, even outside of circumstances beyond their control, such as postpartum depression. Mom Life Comics being just one obvious example. Before we look at the well-being of stay-at-home moms versus employed mothers, we need to first answer the question, are moms happier than non-moms? Because I mentioned that the question itself might seem silly to some people, let's begin then by examining how people even think about parenthood and happiness, which we can do by examining global quantitative data associated with folk theories about parenthood from a literature review conducted by Hansen 2012.
Why don't you have a seat right over there for me, please?
No, it's a study about children, but not like that. These folk theories are the belief that children make people happier, that childless persons are a sad bunch, and that childless people are often selfish hedonists. So are any of those beliefs accurate? According to data from the World Values Survey, which contains data from 97 countries that comprise about 90% of the world's population, contrary to what one might expect, people without children generally reported higher happiness and life satisfaction than do parents. However, these effects were small, making up comparatively 1/5 of the difference in life satisfaction between employed and unemployed persons. This small difference was, however, more negative in women than it was in men, and over time the negative effect changed to positive as subjects aged. That is, children can reduce happiness while they are children, but seem to increase happiness as they grow up and move out, such that parenthood had a negative effect on happiness for those under 40, a near zero effect for those in their 40s, and a positive effect on happiness for those over 50, being most pronounced in women. Those are the aggregate global data, but what about different regions? In the US, parenthood had a negative impact on happiness and life satisfaction, and it had a negative relationship with life satisfaction in Australia. In both the US and Australia, the negative effect on life satisfaction dissipates or turns positive for older parents as their children leave the nest. In Europe, parenthood was negatively related to happiness and life satisfaction, both in general and country by country, being either significantly negative as it was in the UK, France, the Netherlands, Denmark, Ireland, and Portugal, or non-significantly negative as it was in Germany, Belgium, Italy, Luxembourg, Spain, and Greece. There were some studies that found the opposite, as for example, parents under 45 reported higher life satisfaction than did non-parents in Germany, and there was a positive effect of being a parent to children aged 20 to 50 across 26 different countries, although this effect was stronger in men than in women. There was also a wide degree of variability across countries as this positive effect was present in Austria and the Nordic countries, yet the relationship remained negative in Bulgaria, Italy, Luxembourg, Poland, and Slovenia. For parents with an empty nest, having a non-resident child was generally either weakly positive or non-existent. In terms of longitudinal data, several studies found that those who became parents experienced greater decreases in well-being compared to those who remained childless over the same period of time in both the US and Australia. In Germany, there was a positive effect after birth for 1 year in men and 2 years in women. However, by the time that the first child was 4 or 5 years old, this relationship turned negative. Similar findings were reported in England, where the birth of one's first child had a positive effect on women but not men's life satisfaction, also turning negative by the time that the child was more than 2 years old. In Australia, life satisfaction increased for 1 year after birth in both sexes, but diminished to near zero after the first year. Of course, there are a bunch of possible confounds in these raw correlations, and not just because Australian parents are forced to start sharing their cigarettes with their school-aged children.
How long have you been smoking for?
48 years.
And how old are you?
52.
You're gonna f***ing die of lung cancer, mate. You're gonna get punched in the face by the long dick of cancer.
But because not all of the findings are negative, the data are not indicative that well-being influences the likelihood that one will become a parent. That is, it does not appear to be the case that happier people are more likely to reproduce and vice versa. In general, parenthood appeared to move from positive to negative over time between data collected before 1995 to after 1995. Although there were differences across nations, with the Nordic countries experiencing less negative outcomes associated with parenting, perhaps as a result of those nations' work-family policies that make transitioning into being a parent easier than in other countries. One longitudinal study in this analysis found that overall, the negative associations with parenting seemed to appear between the 1950s and 1970s, coinciding with increased divorce rates and the women's rights movement. In line with that finding, analysis revealed that parenthood uniquely negatively affected the well-being of single parents, be they male or female, across 26 European countries and Australia. In contrast, parenthood had a weak but positive influence on the well-being and life satisfaction of partnered couples in 22 European countries, with the exception of the Nordic nations, in which there was no relationship between marital status and parental status on happiness or life satisfaction. Globally, being a mother was consistently related to greater life satisfaction in widows. Looking at other variations from the aggregate, parenthood had a more positive effect on life satisfaction in more educated parents, while it had a negative effect on happiness in lower-income parents, unsurprisingly. Life satisfaction and happiness also tended to decrease as the number of children increased. In some studies, having children between the ages of 12 and 15 was associated negatively with happiness, particularly in women, while other studies found no such relationship. Although I can understand why children in that age range might decrease happiness.
Dropped out of high school because of Tab G. That's true.
I wish he were lying about that, but that's actually true.
First suck. Now I go to evangelical boarding.
What was fairly consistent is that when childlessness moved from voluntary to involuntary as women aged out of their fertile years, that childlessness was associated with depression and lower life satisfaction, also particularly in women. As I said before, cue Joni Mitchell.
No eggs. Empty egg carton. You don't have any eggs.
Well, close enough. To summarize then, having children doesn't magically make everybody happier, and in fact it can be an extremely stressful experience that at large tends to decrease life satisfaction and happiness until those children are a bit older. But overall findings are largely positive longitudinally, and when accounting for individual factors that make parenthood more or less stressful. The findings then from this massive analysis are indicative, however, that becoming a parent is not all sunshine and rainbows. Not that I would imagine most people, including most parents, think that it is. But even though it doesn't massively improve lives immediately, it seems to be a positive thing for people long term. One of the problems with Hansen's data, though, is that it's largely correlational, and it doesn't allow us to see how parenthood changes or does not change happiness and satisfaction in individual parents. But we can find out how parenthood changes the lives of those parents in a longitudinal analysis of data from the German socioeconomic panel conducted by Beichmann, Staub, and Schröder in 2016, who thoroughly examined well-being in parents both before and after the birth of their first child, as well as potentially confounding variables. They found that in the years before motherhood, women who would go on to have children had virtually the same degrees of happiness as non-mothers, meaning it's unlikely that happier women become parents. However, the scholars did find that women who became mothers reported higher levels of life satisfaction than non-mothers in the 5 years before the birth of a child. This was not the case for all mothers, but instead only mothers who planned their pregnancies, as mothers with unplanned pregnancies had lower levels of life satisfaction. Rather predictably, as no one really has their lives improved by the surprise inability to control their bladder for 9 months, culminating in being unzipped like a pillowcase. But anyway, women with more human capital, measured here by previous higher educational attainment, were more satisfied with their lives both before and after birth. Personally, I didn't care for that expansion of Binding of Isaac, but that's just me. Although women with less human capital also increased in their satisfaction between 2 to 5 years after birth, this increase was relatively smaller in size. In the 12 years after birth, the average difference in life satisfaction between mothers and non-mothers was 0.3 on an 11-point scale in favor of mothers. Prospective mothers reported being happier than non-mothers 1 year before childbirth, and maximum life satisfaction differences between mothers and non-mothers was between 0.52 and 0.56 on that 11-point scale, which was typically reached in the year of delivery. This effect is larger than the effect of unemployment on life satisfaction and twice the effect size of being divorced on satisfaction. In other words, women are generally very happy with being a mother before their children are old enough to talk, and they tend to decrease in that happiness as they learn to complain.
So how's your life? Yeah, not bad. Steady decline.
Over time, this effect levels out, likely a product of adaptation to life as a mother, or that whole talking thing. However, motherhood remained a positive correlate to life satisfaction over 12 years after birth. Compared to being employed, these data were indicative that the total effect of motherhood after 12 years is similar to the effect of between 1.01 and 1.94 yearly incomes. That is, being a mother contributes to well-being up to nearly twice as much as income does, in some instances. Older mothers, those over the age of 35, experienced greater gains than younger mothers, and only the youngest group, those between 26 and 29, experienced any negative effects on happiness due to motherhood. That's gains in happiness, not in muscle. These results were similar for women after the birth of their first child and for women with multiple children, although the temporary increase in happiness after childbirth is about half as much for the second child than it is for the first, indicating perhaps a bit of tolerance to the baby rabies. Finally, fathers also saw similar trends to mothers, although the effect sizes both before and after birth were smaller in scope. The results of this study then do seem to illustrate that motherhood is a positive thing long term. Although it can cause some declines, ultimately mothers are happier than non-mothers to the same degree as if an employed woman made, on average, 50% more income, or to the difference in happiness between being employed versus being unemployed. So ladies, either increase your income by nearly twice as much as you currently make, or have a baby to be happier. Either way, you're probably going to have to please a man above you. But were any of these women actually happier, or were they just pretending to be because the patriarchy tells them that being a mother is what makes them happy? I've seen plenty of arguments from feminists that would imply as such. So, do the presence of norms in society that value motherhood influence happiness and satisfaction in women? Soups examined this question across 2 studies, utilizing data from 49 countries with different degrees of gender equality. In her study, drawing from information collected by the World Values Survey between 1981 and 2004, Soups assessed subjective well-being, the belief that motherhood was the norm, the country gender inequality index, and gender equality norms. She found that respondents who endorsed the motherhood norm reported being happier than those who did not. However, this effect was small, although comparable to the difference between having the fewest versus the most years of education in happiness for women worldwide. There was no relationship between acceptance of motherhood as the norm and life satisfaction. Subjective well-being was more strongly associated with endorsing the motherhood norm in countries with greater gender inequality, and the strength of the association grew as the level of inequality grew in the nation. In countries with more gender parity, there was little relationship between endorsing motherhood and both happiness and life satisfaction. In total, there was a small but significant relationship between acceptance of the motherhood norm and subjective well-being, although this effect was more robust in countries with greater gender inequality. That is, people who believe that motherhood is an important part of a woman's life fulfillment are more likely to be happier and more satisfied with their lives, particularly when they don't live in a country with strong feminist beliefs and gender equality. But just because thinking motherhood is a good thing for women seems to be a positive thing, in theory, is it in reality? In her second study, Soups examined the satisfaction in women with children or without children in countries with different degrees of gender equality. She found that after controlling for demographic covariates, women without children reported lower happiness than mothers, equivalent to that of about half the effect of having the lowest level of education versus the highest. There was no evidence for any significant interaction between endorsing motherhood as a norm with actually being a mother on either life satisfaction or on subjective well-being, nor was there any three-way interaction with country-level gender norms. And I could have made a joke about women and three-way interactions, but I didn't because this is an educational video, obviously. Although in this analysis, women in gender unequal countries were less happy and less satisfied, that seemingly did not influence the positive effects of motherhood, which was stronger in those same regions in influencing well-being. When looking at specific women then, and following her happiness over time, it does seem that motherhood is positively related to increased happiness worldwide, although it is stronger in non-feminist nations. It is perhaps important to note that happiness is a measure that is often exclusively examining hedonic pleasure, and parenthood is often fulfilling while not being particularly pleasurable, at least according to pretty much any parent I've ever spoken to. And as such, a massive analysis like the ones that we've looked at earlier from Hansen, while useful, don't account for the meaningfulness associated with being a parent. While there isn't a ton of research that I was able to locate that specifically examined eudaimonia, that's meaningfulness with parenting, which I frankly found a bit bizarre, it might be because scholars don't always tend to use that precise term. One study I did find, though, from Brandel, Melchiori, and Ruini, names who sound like they should be teaching abjuration, not social science, did however examine the roles of eudaimonia in parenting using a sample of pregnant couples from northern Italy and the RIF Psychological Wellbeing Scale, which includes a measure of purpose in life, as well as a postpartum depression instrument, which is not, as I initially believed, just an Italian term for a wine glass. Before giving birth, mothers were higher on the postpartum depression scale, which they maintained after birth, while fathers were very low in postpartum depression and quite high in psychological well-being. Gender accounted for 4.6% of the variance in the postnatal measure of well-being, including eudaimonia, while the prenatal measure of well-being accounted for 70% of the variance in well-being. Thus, for both parents, the transition into parenthood produced increased eudaimonic well-being, although this effect was more pronounced in fathers than it was in mothers. So while parenthood may reduce happiness, it does seem to increase feelings of purpose in life, and particularly so in fathers. But this video is about the mom boss phenomenon, and we have already seen how little mom bosses care about their husband's peachy keen happiness. In fact, we've shown how a husband's happiness is actually harmful to a marriage. So let's move more directly into understanding women, marriage, child-rearing, and happiness in the context of employment and working. In order to fully understand the relationship between life satisfaction, marriage, and employment status versus being a stay-at-home wife or mother, we should look to both modern and historic data to examine if things have changed over time as more and more women have entered the workforce and fewer have chosen to or even been able to dedicate her time primarily to housework or motherhood. Although, as we mentioned in the beginning, those trends have been reversing over the last decade. To get a better idea of previous levels of satisfaction across different types of married women specifically, we can look to a study from Freudinger 1983, who examined data collected from the GSS and conducted by the National Opinion Research Center between 1973 and 1977. And I know that's a long time ago, but we're trying to get a baseline here. Women's employment status was broken down into 3 categories: currently employed, either fully or part-time, formerly employed for at least 1 year, or never employed. And all were questioned regarding their levels of satisfaction with community, family, friends, leisure, and work, as well as about various individual differences, including having children, level of education, physical health, both religious and political participation, and her husband's occupational prestige. She found that working wives were slightly younger with an average age of 40.4 years than never employed wives with an age of 41.6, and formerly employed wives with an average age of 43.6 years. Working wives tended to be the most educated, followed by formerly employed wives, while never employed wives had completed the fewest years of education. As one might expect, household income was lower in households where the wife had never worked. Looking to regression analysis, for working wives, happiness with marriage was the most important variable, which explained 13.5% of variance in total life satisfaction, following by her husband's occupational prestige, which explained just 3% of variance. Working wives became more satisfied with life as they aged, and again, predictably, being in better health and being more satisfied with finances were also predictors of life satisfaction in working women. For formerly working women, having a happy marriage explained even more of the variance, coming in at 17% of variance accounted for, while financial satisfaction explained 4% and religious participation explained just 1.5%. Similarly to working women, age and perceived health were both positively associated with life satisfaction. Things were a bit different for never employed wives, though, for whom financial satisfaction was the strongest predictor of life satisfaction, explaining 14% of the variance, rather than marriage satisfaction as it was in the other 2 groups of women. Freudinger speculated that because wives who had never worked were completely financially dependent on their husbands, and even lacked a frame of reference from which to understand personal financial contributions to the family's finances, the earnings of her husband were more important as a determinant of her total life satisfaction than happiness with the marriage itself. Wives who had never worked derived more satisfaction from religious participation and from voting, but also gained more satisfaction from having obtained a higher level of education than women in the other 2 categories. In turn, having preschool and school-aged children decreased never-employed women's life satisfaction, while young kids did not have this deleterious effect on other wives. This may be because, as a stay-at-home mom, these women again had no frame of reference against which to compare full-time motherhood with full or part-time employment. So for women who were working or who had worked in the past, they appreciated their time spent taking care of children, being able to compare that time to time spent in the workplace. Meaning perhaps moms who have never worked see parenting as more stressful than moms who have worked a job. And even though these data concern women in the 1970s, looking at you there, Mary. At the same time, never-employed wives reported higher levels of satisfaction when their children were teenaged, which Freudinger suggests may allow her a form of living vicariously through her kids, as unlike other wives, life satisfaction dropped in never-employed mothers with age, possibly indicating a kind of empty nest syndrome after the children leave the familial home. But things have surely changed since the 1970s, namely the women's rights movement, and the number of women in the workforce versus staying at home. which has been on an upward trend until quite recently, again. So, what are things like for working versus stay-at-home moms now on this side of the second millennium? Well, a study from Craney and Miles 2017 examined work satisfaction in mothers between 1972 and 2012, utilizing data from the GSS, and may provide us with some answers. Mothers were asked how satisfied they were with the work that she did, which could include part-time work, full-time work, or keeping house. They found that the majority of women were moderately to very satisfied with their work, regardless of whether it was paid employment or being a full-time mom. Once again, illustrating that women are generally pretty happy, or at least they used to be. However, at a broad level, employed mothers were more satisfied with their work than stay-at-home moms. But this changed over time. Specifically, in 1974, stay-at-home moms had a negative 0.09 lower probability of being very satisfied with work, but this tendency altered over time, becoming statistically indistinguishable from zero by 1998. Further, the percentage of respondents who strongly agreed that being a housewife is just as fulfilling as paid work increased from 1990 to 2006. However, it seems that the degree to which women felt satisfied with being a full-time mother was somewhat dependent on general cultural perceptions of women's roles in society. Specifically, when only 21% of the US population agreed that being a housewife could be as fulfilling as paid work, which was the minimum reported agreement on that instrument occurring in the early 1990s, being a stay-at-home mom had a negative effect on work satisfaction. However, when that rose to just 32% of the population, there was no longer any relationship between being a stay-at-home mom and work satisfaction, comparative to employed mothers, indicating that women's happiness with work is seemingly heavily dependent on social norms, further indicating that social science exists to evidence the obvious and call women out on their BS. Household income and class status also played a role, as moms with college degrees, who presumably are of higher class status than those without a college degree, were more affected by changes in work satisfaction related to single motherhood. Additionally, and predictably, stay-at-home moms from wealthier households experienced the greatest gains in life satisfaction and were more satisfied with their work by 2012 than employed mothers, much like the author of Mom Life Comics, who has a lawyer husband and doesn't need to work, yet still feels the need to complain about it. These scholars suggest that the increasing happiness with their job as a mother seen in women over time is highly dependent on societal acceptance of that role, which means, curiously, the women's rights movement, in its emphasis on women working and being in the workplace and not in the home, could have significantly negatively influenced women's satisfaction with being full-time moms, and it was only when it became more socially acceptable to be a mom as a profession that women who chose to be mothers as their primary job became more satisfied with that role, as were women in the workforce. Feminists made women less satisfied with their lives. How shocking. We can further examine broad changes in happiness across mothers and non-mothers over time that seems to reflect societal changes in acceptance of being a stay-at-home mom versus being a working mother in a study of German women between 1984 and 2015 from Preisner et al. They found that mothers and non-mothers showed a similar course of life satisfaction with a slight drop in the 1990s through the mid-2000s, followed by a rise going into the 2010s, at which point mothers' satisfaction outpaced non-mothers. Specifically, up until 2010, women reported lower satisfaction in life in every previous year of assessment in-between subjects design, while within subjects, that is only amongst mothers, life satisfaction had been increasing slowly but steadily since 1996. When controlling for socioeconomic variables, this relationship started to become more clear as mothers were less satisfied when they had fewer socioeconomic resources, and given that children can be quite expensive, it makes sense why mothers may be less satisfied with their finances, because they were worried about their dependents. Or in other words, in the past, mothers had reported lower life satisfaction than women without children, at least in part because it was more difficult for them to pursue a career and full-time work, which may have led to them having fewer socioeconomic resources. Now, that was largely the conclusion of the authors, but I would also like to add that the rising costs of housing, healthcare, and college have made it so that while a family could easily live on a single earner's average income of about $25,000 a year in 1985, at least in the US if not in East Germany, meaning that there was generally no need for a married woman to work in the 1980s in order to be secure in her socioeconomic status, that began to change in the 1990s and 2000s, and more women entered the workforce, and as such, I'm not so sure about the scholar's conclusion that mothers' lower socioeconomic satisfaction in the past was because she had fewer work opportunities. It seems that boomers perhaps made a mess of motherhood, as with so many other things.
Oh, he punched me in the face!
And I don't say that without evidence, because also from the research itself, as more women disagreed with the statement that mothers should not work outside of the home in this dataset, the more conducive motherhood became to life satisfaction. both within groups of mothers and between groups of mothers and non-mothers. This changed over time as near the end of the observation period in the mid-2010s, the differences between mothers and non-mothers seemed to vanish altogether with the relaxing of social norms for maternal employment at the raw dataset level. However, the findings actually did remain consistent when controlling for socioeconomic status, in that mothers were increasingly more satisfied than women without children. Over time, the more women disagreed with the statement that mothers should stay home, the more conducive motherhood was to life satisfaction for women who continued with a full-time job, changed to a part-time job, or quit working altogether. That is, the more feminist influence in society, the more motherhood remained a positive influence on women working both in employment and in the home, with one exception, that being that motherhood was associated with reduced satisfaction in women who had lost their jobs. Rather unsurprisingly, because getting fired sucks for most people, except maybe those doing the firing.
Mr. Gribble, how would you like to make this your permanent job?
Firing Gladstone? Sure. Gladstone!
No.
The more women who disagreed with the belief that women should not work, the smaller the gap in satisfaction between mothers working full-time and non-employed mothers was, with unintentional unemployment remaining as a persistently negative influence. In total then, as fewer and fewer people agreed with the notion that women should not work outside of the home, motherhood was increasingly conducive to life satisfaction. The maternal happiness gap vanished, maternal employment was increasingly beneficial in terms of life satisfaction, and the happiness gaps between mothers with different working statuses narrowed with the exception of newly unemployed mothers. In short, again, the opinions of society at large seem to have a significant effect on the happiness of mothers. In terms of various other variables that might influence this trend, the scholars found that single mothers consistently reported lower life satisfaction, but that was largely attributable to demographic characteristics and low socioeconomic resources of those mothers. The number of children seemingly made no difference in the disparity between happiness of mothers and non-mothers, as it was a transition into motherhood that made the difference, not the number of children, at least, again, at the raw data level. However, when adjusting for SES factors, mothers with one child and non-mothers reported the same levels of life satisfaction, but mothers of 2 or more children reported higher life satisfaction, although to be fair, there may be an upper limit to that one.
I've got no option but to sell you all for scientific experiments. No, that's the way it is, my loves. Blame the Catholic Church for not letting me wear one of those little rubber things.
There was no apparent difference in the positive effect of motherhood regarding the gender of her children. So overall then, motherhood became increasingly positive for women over time in Germany, despite the decreasing percentage of people who posited that a woman's role should be as a mother rather than in the workforce. Again, this presents as a seeming paradox, as while women's rights increased, women simultaneously became happier as mothers and homemakers. Despite the increasingly positive effect of motherhood in Germany, it's possible that part of the reason that some stay-at-home moms were less satisfied with their role in society is because they felt that said role was simply sexist or regressive and inappropriate for a modern woman to hold.
President of the World Bank, and you still find the time to make the nicest peccary pie in all the long box. Oh, Darlene, I remember when the least little problem used to put you right to sleep.
Oh, not anymore, Madge. Today's modern now a go-go woman just pops these simple little pills called Anger Dream.
What about the opposite case, though? Women who feel trapped by motherhood and unable to sustain their career goals. We can learn more about that by looking to a longitudinal study from Johnstone and Lucky, 2021, who examined the life satisfaction of Australian women, drawing from 2 waves of data collected from women born between 1973 and 1978, once when they were in their mid-20s and again when they were in their mid-30s. Remember that in Australia, of course, taking care of children and fending off random encounters with the wildlife is a uniquely taxing motherhood experience. The scholars compared the answers women gave to various questions while in their mid-20s, including what kind of job they would like to have, and if they would like to be a mother by the time she turned 35, and compared these answers to measures of career satisfaction, motherhood satisfaction, overall life satisfaction, mental health, relationship status, and financial stress from the same cohort of women a decade later when they were on average about 35. These 2 times of assessment allow us to get a clearer picture to better understand how young women growing up after the women's rights movement felt about career versus motherhood and whether or not they were truly happier in the workforce rather than in the home.
So I get to work outside the home? Totally. You get to sit in a cubicle all day while you stare at a computer screen, chugging coffee. So liberating, right?
but the researchers also recruited 45 women from the survey sample, 6 of whom were stay-at-home moms, with whom they conducted semi-structured interviews to really get a better idea of how these women felt. Of the 22.5% of respondents who indicated at the time that she was a stay-at-home mother, 83% previously aspired to be employed either full-time or part-time, meaning only 17% had always wanted to be stay-at-home moms, an extremely low percentage comparative to the US Gallup polling data. But how did that low percentage influence outcomes for these women? Well, first, a vast majority of stay-at-home moms were married or in a de facto married relationship, 91%, with 3% being single or widowed and 6% being divorced. Financial stress and relationship status accounted for 8% of variance in mental health, 6% overall life satisfaction, 2.5% for satisfaction with motherhood, and 2% for satisfaction with career. Those who reported thinking that managing family income was easy had better mental health and life satisfaction and tended to be more satisfied with their careers, but not with motherhood. Being separated or divorced was related to mental health issues, lower life satisfaction, and greater dissatisfaction with being a mother, while being single or widowed was only associated with mental health struggles, but not other issues of dissatisfaction. Prior aspirations previous to becoming a mother, while these women were in their 20s, did not account for any additional variance in mental health, overall life satisfaction, and satisfaction with motherhood in their 30s. And although prior desire to be employed full-time was uniquely associated with lower life satisfaction, it did not account for significant change in variance in the model, unlike other assessed variables pertinent to Aussie life, including the consumption of copious amounts of illegal substances.
And have you taken any illegal substances today, Miss Guffey? Not for 5 years. Good riddance to that evil shit. It rots your mind, body and soul. So on the whole, I'm done with ice, crack, gax and smack, and I've got the token from NA to prove exactly that. I'm just trying to set a good example for me daughter. Okay, you've tested positive to speed.
Stay-at-home moms who had previously desired to work full-time, however, were less satisfied with their careers than women who had always wanted to be homemakers. But this was the only significant difference. Open-ended responses allow us to gain greater insight into the feelings of these women regarding their life choices. Of the 6 women that were stay-at-home moms, only 2 indicated that they had always wanted to be in that role. The first did note, however, that she had been unmotivated in school and did not attend university, and the second mentioned that her child had major health issues that required long stays in hospital and daily monitoring, both circumstances that may have made having a career far more difficult for these 2 women. Concerning finances, several mothers mentioned working for several years before having children to get ahead on things. Some mentioned prioritizing needs over wants, and others discussed the cost of childcare. In terms of cultural norms, one woman expressed that both she and her husband were raised on farms with mothers who served traditional roles as homemakers, while another said that if she were to return to the workforce, that would mean more housework for her husband, which she implied would just be unfair, given that he was the primary breadwinner. And even if she were to work just 1 day a month, that's 1 day that would present a major change for her home dynamic, a sentiment surely unfathomable to Mary Starr. Several women mentioned childcare as being inferior to a mother's care, with participant 3 saying, quote,
"From what I hear, there's lots of daycare centers and that sort of thing, and kids can be dropped off at school, and have before-school care and after-school care. I'm of the other camp. I think kids would be so much better if somebody, not necessarily a mother, but if somebody stayed home and looked after them. I think there's so much more to be gained from having someone who loves you and is raising you as they want you to be, rather than just someone taking care of you."
Some of the stay-at-home moms hinted at the divide between employed women and themselves, and one even stated that she was probably a bad participant for what she believed the scholars were trying to study, because her life ambition was always to be a mother, and as such, she felt that she had achieved her life goals, even though those goals were not modern, illustrating that perhaps some stay-at-home mothers feel, if not ashamed, at least out of place with what a woman should be in the 21st century. I do applaud the authors for keeping her comments in the study, as she was probably right in that she was not the type of participant that they were really looking for. Despite the problems these mothers faced, though, participant 5 was explicit that she was very satisfied with her life and felt totally in control of it. In total, then, it does seem that stay-at-home moms are generally not worse off psychologically than employed mothers, regardless of whether or not being a full-time mother was her goal in life. Although women were less satisfied with being a mom as a job when they had previously aspired to be employed in the workforce full-time. We can gain more information about the happiness of employed mothers compared to stay-at-home moms by looking to a study from Hemplova 2016, utilizing data from mothers between 25 and 49 living with at least 1 child collected by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development concerning their employment and levels of happiness. Overall, there was little difference in happiness between homemakers versus working mothers among women with children under the age of 3. as 3/4 of both groups reported feeling happy most of the time. There were some differences by nation, however, as female employment produced more happiness in Lithuania, Romania, and Slovenia, while being a stay-at-home mom produced more happiness in Estonia, Germany, Spain, and Finland. In contrast to moms of kids under 3, mothers of school-age children were slightly happier as homemakers than being full-time working mothers. As such, in countries with low maternal employment rates, stay-at-home mothers with small children were generally happier than employed mothers, while working mothers were happier than homemakers in countries where maternal employment was more common. Once again, we can see here that social norms seem to play a significant role in how happy women are as either mothers or workers. Speaking of social norms, how do women themselves feel about motherhood, and how does it differ based on whether she herself is a mother? McQuillian et al. 2008 examined this question in a sample of American women between ages 25 and 45. Subjects were asked how important motherhood was to their lives, the value she placed on work and leisure activities, cultural and religious beliefs, relationship status, as well as several questions regarding control variables, including general health and economic concerns. As one might expect, the average importance of motherhood was significantly higher for mothers than for non-mothers, and there was less variance in mothers' opinions on motherhood than in non-mothers. Very few mothers reported that motherhood was of low importance, and virtually none rated motherhood amongst the lowest levels of importance. Small mercies. Looking to regression analysis, there was a significant positive association between valuing success at work and the importance of motherhood for mothers, but not for non-mothers, indicating mothers value both work and motherhood simultaneous, while non-mothers typically only tended to value work. In contrast, there was no relationship between valuing motherhood and valuing leisure in mothers, but for non-mothers, the relationship was significant and negative, meaning non-mothers who value leisure time were less likely to value motherhood, likely seeing motherhood as a status that would seriously deleteriously impact their leisure. Just goes to show that most Darwin Award winners are women, albeit not in the most interesting or amusing way that most people come about being Darwin Award winners, but instead slowly while surrounded by cats and, again, boxed wine. Once again proving that women are bad at comedy.
Now, in real life, I know there are loads of funny women. Like, I did it again, well spotted.
Additionally, mothers who were employed full-time placed less value on motherhood than full-time moms not in the labor force. There was no relationship between valuing motherhood and levels of education, which was contrary to the researchers' hypothesis, as they anticipated that more educated women would place less value on motherhood. Perhaps they did not consider that more educated women might be more aware of some of this research on why motherhood is generally a pretty good thing, but I digress. More religious women placed more value on motherhood, while holding egalitarian gender attitudes was associated with less importance placed on motherhood. Older non-mothers placed the least value on motherhood, also known as a cope, while age played no role in the value of motherhood in mothers. Widowed and never married mothers placed less importance on motherhood than did married mothers, perhaps because of the many challenges faced by single moms, including but not limited to finances, childcare, and the continued threat of Ezra Miller. In total then, while it's perhaps not surprising that mothers think motherhood is more important than non-mothers, it is interesting that said relationship is so consistent across women of different education levels, relationship and employment status, yet is still seemingly so heavily influenced by social norms.
Women crave for being loved, not for loving. They scream out at you for sympathy all day long. They are incapable of giving any in return, for they cannot state a fact accurately to another, nor can that other woman attend to it accurately enough for it to become information. Now, is not all of this the result of want of sympathy? I am sick with indignation at what wives and mothers will do of the most shocking selfishness. And people call it all maternal or conjugal affection and think it pretty to say so. No, let each person tell the truth from their own experience. They really don't have sympathy or the ability to empathize because they are always judging everyone and everything as a product on a social value scale that relates to their own egos and bounces off themselves. There is no capability for genuine feeling. This is what I have experienced with women. There is no capability for genuine feelings for other humans or really in general, except when those feelings are for themselves and the other people are just proxies to bounce ideas off of.
Based. Absolutely based.
So, ultimately, is motherhood good for women? Holton, Fisher, and Rowe 2010 attempted to answer that question in a sample of Australian mothers and non-mothers aged 30 to 34 who were questioned on their physical and mental health, current and lifetime experiences with depression, satisfaction with life, and personal well-being. The majority of women, nearly 75%, reported that they wanted children. There was no significant difference between mothers and childless women on mental health scores. However, mothers reported greater life satisfaction and personal well-being. After controlling for various socio-demographic characteristics, this relationship remained consistent, in that mothers had greater subjective well-being and life satisfaction than non-mothers. Interestingly, scores on the mental health measure were similar across scores of postpartum mothers, non-postpartum mothers, and childless women, indicating that even women who had recently given birth were not struggling with their mental health more than mothers or childless women. Perhaps that's because giving birth is a bit like taking off one's weighted training clothing. In turn, postpartum mothers actually had the highest levels of life satisfaction compared to non-postpartum mothers and non-mothers, indicating that giving birth contributes uniquely to feelings of fulfillment. Further, there was no significant difference in the number of postpartum mothers, non-postpartum mothers, and non-mothers who were currently or had previously been depressed, meaning that problems with clinical depression do not appear to be contingent on motherhood status. So with everything that we've looked at today and all of that in mind, let's come to a few conclusions about women's happiness and motherhood. Over the course of this long video, we've seen how, in previous decades, women were consistently happier and more satisfied with their lives than were men. But that began to change over time, coinciding with the women's rights movement as more and more women began to enter the workforce full-time. It was not until the last decade or so that women began returning to life as homemakers and mothers that this trend has seemingly reversed in direction. However, women's happiness has continued to plummet, now falling below that of men in multiple first-world nations. The countries that have maintained a higher life satisfaction and happiness in women are those with lower levels of gender equality. At the same time, marriages wherein men are happier than women are more likely to end in divorce, only adding to women's unhappiness. While motherhood seems to generally be a positive thing for women's lives, particularly long-term, there are several confounding variables, including marriage and socioeconomic status, that influence the positive effects of motherhood. Several studies illustrate that the happiness bestowed by full-time motherhood versus employment is easily influenced by cultural and social norms, with women being more satisfied with being a mom during periods of time where more people believe that being a mother as a job is socially acceptable, indicating that a significant element of women's happiness as either a mother or a girl boss is dependent on how much other women and men feel about those roles. As such, there are multiple paradoxes that plague women's life satisfaction, particularly in the West. There is no simple answer to the question, then, of whether women are happier as mothers or as girl bosses. As, well, in general, the answer may appear to be yes, it is highly contingent on the opinions of others and social norms. So instead, I have to ask all of you, what do you guys think? Why do you think that women's happiness has been declining over the decades, particularly in first world countries, even as women have gained more and more rights? Does motherhood make women happy, or is it just a bunch of bonding hormones that make women think that she likes being a mom? Are women happier in the workplace than in the home? Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. If you have enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you're not already subscribed, as well as leave a comment to feed that algorithm. All of that stuff really helps me out. If you want to support the channel, there are links to my Patreon and Subscribestar in the video description, as well as a link to my merch store. You can also find a link to my sponsor in the description and in the pinned comment. And if you really want to hear more from me, I do 2 podcasts a week. Broken Crown, which is a politics and news podcast I do with my co-host Spoon, which is every Wednesday at 8:30 p.m. GMT, 3:30 p.m. EST. And Rolling in the Isles, which is a tabletop game that I'm playing with Uzalu and Kami Mark along with some other friends. That's every Tuesday at 9 p.m. GMT, 4 p.m. EST. Thank you all so much for watching and being patient, as it does take a while for me to put together these heavily researched videos. I hope to see some of you drop by the live shows. Take care of yourselves, and as always, dear friends, Untitled.